So good afternoon, everybody. I will continue now on the chapter about theories of demography. And now we are starting on the portion about migration theory. But just a little comment here, like the last quiz 6 that we had right after the previous class, 30% of the class did not answer the quiz. And it might not sound like much, like just 1 point per quiz, but every point counts, and that's important. So 30% of the people did not answer quiz 6. And after the class today, we have quiz 7. And just looking at the total number of points that you had already available from exam 1 in the first 6 quizzes, so far only 12% of the class has an A, at least 90%. So just remember to take the quizzes, take your time, review the material. It's open until noon after the class day. So just be careful with that. My idea with the quizzes is exactly to provide an ongoing process of evaluation throughout the semester. Okay? So we finished the last class talking about these migration terms. So internal migration is the change in residence permanently when you move within a country, and international migration, that's that change of residence between countries. And here, I'm just summarizing the terms that we use when you're talking about internal migration and international migration. If I'm doing an analysis of internal migration, so population movements within a country, so I'm doing a study about internal migration, and if my focus is on the effects on the area of destination, I'm talking about in-migration. If I want to see the effects of the areas that are losing that population, then I'm doing an analysis of out-migration. And same thing applies to international migration, but then the terms are immigration and immigration. Usually here in the US, we hear a lot the term immigration because we usually focus on analysis of how population flows from other countries are affecting in some way the American population, the American society. When I say affecting, I'm not saying that's positive or negative. I'm just saying that's changing the American society. And so whenever you hear the term immigration, because we are focusing on analysis about migrants coming from other countries to the US, and we are looking at the effects here in the country of destination, right? And there are several factors involved on migration. And we talked a little bit already about fertility and mortality. And fertility and mortality, they happen in response to both biological and social factors, right? Women have children due in part to their fecundity, to their biological ability of having children, but also to a series of other social, economic, and demographic factors that I'm calling here social factors, such as education attainment, for example. Usually women with higher levels of education attainment, they have fewer children. So that's related to really their decision in that society to have more or less children. Fecundity is related to the biology. Mortality goes in the same way. The way that my society is organized, whether I have enough health resources, if I have treated water, sewer system, all these basic services in my society, that will tend to decrease the chances of dying. So mortality in this case is related to social factors. But people in the same society, even those in the same socioeconomic status, same education and everything, some of them are more prone to live longer than others. So that's related to biological factors. So fertility and mortality are related to both the levels of fertility and mortality are related to both biological and social factors. Migration has no biological factors. So person migrates to factors in the physical and social environments at both the areas of origin and destination. Personal individual factors can influence migration. You could also say that, so I'm looking at characteristics of areas of origin and destination. Those characteristics are related to the context. Do I have enough opportunities for my life in the future in terms of education and work in the area of origin? If I do more than here than in other places, I will not get out of the area of origin. But if I see another area as giving me more opportunities, then I will be more likely to migrate out. So I'm moving due to differences in contextual factors when I compare the place where I live to other places where I would go to. And of course, similar people that are from the same area of origin, some of them might be more likely to migrate than others because of individual decisions, individual characteristics, socioeconomic, educational characteristics. But all these factors here are related to social factors, not to biological factors, right? So a major question is like, why do people move? And that's what the theories of migration try to explain. We know that people are moving from different areas, and we want to know why they are moving. So migration happens in response to a reason that the person believes cannot be satisfied in the current area of residence. And the study of migration goes back to the classical economic development theory. So Ravenstein is known to be the first one that tried to understand the reasons of migration, of human migration, of people migrating from one area to the other. Migration is considered to be a mechanism that establishes regional, spatial, economic equilibrium. What does it mean? Regional, spatial, economic equilibrium. Let's think about internal migration. Let's think the US divided in 50 areas, 50 states in the US. The idea here from this theory is that if some specific states have better opportunities for people to work and to get good education, they will attract more migrants within the country. So there will be more in-migration states. And in states that have few opportunities for these people will have people getting out of those states. So those will be more out-migration states. And in this theory, the idea is that people will continue to move until the opportunities in all these different areas, in my example here, the 50 American states, will be more similar. So when they reach these similar levels, that's when we reach this equilibrium. The equilibrium of economic opportunities for all these different areas, these geographical areas. Overall, what we know is that migrants, they move from areas with low income to areas with higher income. So that's what usually people move from areas that have lower economic opportunities to areas that they would have better economic opportunities. And also, they move from densely to sparsely populated areas. That might be more counterintuitive from what we know right now, for example, because internal migration, most of the internal migration are people moving from rural to urban areas, and rural areas have lower density than urban areas. But the idea here is that the rural areas, even with fewer people proportionally to the geographical space, they still have fewer socioeconomic opportunities for those people. So they migrate from those areas to more densely areas where there is more opportunity for them. And in more recent decades, like we talked in the previous slides about the urban transition, is that in the past, people used to migrate mostly from rural to urban areas. Now, internal migration is a little bit more complex. People migrate from urban to other urban areas. Even some people move from larger urban areas to mid-sized cities, which they will have maybe even better opportunities because they are not so densely populated as bigger cities and they don't have so high cost of living, for example. And they could move to other neighborhoods, like to suburbs, to city, on the border of previous cities where they were living before. And usually we expect, in terms of international migration, that the population streams, population flows, are expected to happen between the poorest and wealthiest place and country. So people again, they tend to move from more low-income countries, if you're talking about international migration, to more high-income countries, right? And these studies, like back from 1885 and 1889 from Ravenstein, he tried to summarize some information about migration. What are the reasons? What are the factors associated with migration? So a first important thing is that migration is affected by distance. Most migrants, they move only short distance. You still have international migration, people migrating from different countries, and that's much easier now in recent years because of the development in transportation compared to the time that he wrote this. But still, in terms of volume, you see more migration in shorter distances when you compare to migration to longer, to farther away areas. Migrants often move in stages. As they leave one area, their places are filled by migrants from more distant areas. So people, they migrate from rural areas, and then they might migrate to a mid-sized area, and then they might migrate to a big-sized area. So there are different stages of migration, and as they leave specific areas, it opens the door for other people to come in. So it's not a straightforward of having just one area of origin, one group of areas of origin, and another group of areas of destination. It's much more complex, and people might migrate in stages. People might more than once throughout their lives. Another important thing, another important law of migration. Every migration stream has a compensating counter stream. If we see here in the US history, a lot of African American population moving from south to northern areas, which is called the Great Migration in the US. The African American population tried to get better conditions, areas in which they would have better socioeconomic conditions. Although most of the population in those years, they were like in the 30s, 60s, they were moving from the south to the northeast, you created some networks in between these areas that you could also see people moving in the opposite way as well. A clear example that we also know about stream and counter stream of migration flows is between, like in the international migration example, is between the US and Mexico. Most of the migration used to be from Mexico to the US, but exactly because you created these links of people, families from Mexico coming here to the US, you start to see also the opposite way. People migrating back, return migration, which could be voluntarily or not, could be through deportation and so on. But what you see nowadays, in the clear example in the US, is the amount of people moving from Mexico to the US in specific years, the same amount of going back to Mexico in that same year. So there is a zero net migration. It's just to show that whenever you have an important stream of people going from one area within a country or from one country to the other, you have the counter stream. Usually, the counter stream is smaller in volume compared to the main migration stream. Migrants moving long distances often stop temporarily at major cities or centers of commerce, located between the area of origin and the intended final area of destination. This is related to this topic here that I mentioned before, that migrants, they often move stages. Urban residents are less likely to migrate than rural residents because in urban areas, we usually have more services, we have more opportunities for people to provide to their families, so they are less likely to get out of those areas compared to the rural population. And what is emphasized now in our textbook, there are series of intervening obstacles that affect the levels and trends of migration. Migration is due not only to a person calculating advantage and advantage of areas of origin and destination. Migration is also influenced by obstacles that make it more or less likely to people to migrate from one area to the other. Still, these factors here, these intervening factors, obstacles, they are socioeconomic, they're contextual factors. They're not related to the biology of the individuals, like we discussed before in relation to fertility and mortality. Intervening obstacles is more related to the context of where these people want to migrate from and to. So distance. Farther away areas are less likely to receive migrants from a specific area. Income and job opportunities. So that's related to contextual factors. So what is the average earnings in a specific area or in a specific country? The job opportunities in those areas. They will attract more migrants if they have more job opportunities for them, if there's a demand for their work. The characteristics in the areas of destination, not only related to economic, but also to health services, to education opportunities, to lower costs of living, and so on. Physical barriers and costs, migration laws, so more in the policy side. What are the specific policies being implemented by a country trying to intervene with migrants? That might create some barriers. But what we're going to discuss in the migration chapter, specifically in terms of international migration, is that in 1986, the US increased a lot the border enforcement in the southern border here in the US. And so a lot of government spending to try to avoid immigrants from Latin America to come to the US. So it was 1986 with the IRCA, Immigration Reform and Control Act. And the main study about the consequences about that act, about the 1986 IRCA, is that actually, because you created more barriers in the border, people from Mexico used to come to the US, work here temporarily, and then go back. And were mostly male migrants from Mexico coming and then going back to their families. And they would come mostly to Texas, California, Illinois. But after the increase of border enforcement, what happened was like, oh, now it's harder to get into the country. So we are not going to move there, work for a while and come back. We're going to move and stay in the US. And not only workers would come, they would come and bring their whole family. And moreover, they would not be concentrated just in those 3 states. They went and spread around the whole US. So these laws, these policy laws that were implemented in the US in the end of the 80s, and actually the border enforcement increased a lot after 9/11 in 2001 as well, with further laws and policies being implemented, that actually made people move in, and once they were here, they stayed. So these policies had exactly the opposite effect of what they intended. If those people had the opportunity to come here, get a temporary visa, and come back home, they would have done that. but they didn't have that anymore after the increase in this border enforcement in the South. So what I'm saying is like each one of these factors here that I mentioned, it can generate a lot of different consequences to the migration flows, and it can generate a lot of studies by sociologists, demographers, economists, geographers, to try to understand how these factors influence migration. And in this case, I'm showing a clear example of how border enforcement works in the opposite way as intended, as at least the public discourse. So whenever we talk about increasing border enforcement, building walls, hiring more border patrol agents, that has been shown, looking at data historically here in the US, that it does not work. People will still come in other ways, and will tend to stay, right? And also network information about alternative locality. If I have friends and family that already migrate to a specific country, a specific area, I will know better about opportunities of jobs over there in this area of the nation. So I'll be more likely to migrate. And my personal characteristics, if I'm more well-educated, I might have more connections with people in other areas. I might have better social network, and that will increase my chances of migrating to other areas. And also, but even people with same socioeconomic characteristics, they might have different expectations. So individual expectations might also be important to understand it. And related to this fact that I said before, community and kinship ties. So really related to network that I have, social network that I have with people that migrated before to specific areas, might increase my chances of move there. And if I'm from an area, a country, a community, that a lot of people migrated to another area, if I have like a high percentage of people in those areas there, in that community that migrated to another country, I will better know about that opportunity, even if maybe my specific friends or family did not migrate, but I know that information from the community that it might be sending a lot of people to other countries or to another area of destination. And here I'm gonna present in the next slide some migration theories that they try to explain what are the reasons that people migrate. And what I want to emphasize is this thing here. These migration theories are compatible. They complement each other. In some specific migration flows, some of these theories might be better to explain why people are migrating from one area to the other. There is not always the best theory for all kinds of migration flows. Specific reasons, specific theories might better explain specific flows than other theories, right? And that's the same discussion that we had before when we were talking about the general theories of Malthus and Marx, is that actually they complement each other when we try to understand trends and levels of demographic indicators. So these theories, they emphasize both individual and contextual factors. As examples of individual factors: age, sex, education, race, ethnicity, social network, characteristics of the individual that might make them more likely to move to another area. But these theories also mention that on the other contextual factors might be important to explain why migration happens. So the characteristics in areas of origin and destination might facilitate migration flows. And the characteristics in areas of origin are exactly the push factors. What are the facts that make people get out of those areas? And the pull factors are the factors in areas of destination. What make those destination areas attract more migrants? So those are the pull factors. And that's a funny thing, like since my Portuguese is my first language, I always have to think about push and pull, because push, the verb puxar in Portuguese means pull, to pull. So it's exactly the opposite. So whenever I have to open a door and it has like push and pull, I have to think twice before what I have to do. And always I do the wrong way. It's just a funny thing in my daily life because of the language that I speak. So going a little bit on push and pull factors. So the question of who migrates depends on both the characteristics of area of origin, push factor, and areas of destination, pull factors. So what are some characteristics in the specific area where I might live right now that might make me decide to get out of that area? If I lost a job, for example, and in that specific community, there is an increase in unemployment, so I don't have as many job opportunities there, that will make me more likely to get out. Poverty. If a specific community experiences a lot of poverty, violence, then people might get out of those areas. Discrimination. That's exactly a major factor related to the migration of African Americans to the northeast of the US and even to the west areas in the US after the end of slavery, because they kept facing discrimination, poverty, and violence, so they would move out from southern areas. And more recently, they start to go back, but that historically was the case. The low availability of social and life partners. Life partners, that's a really clear case of people migrating from and to China, exactly because of the really high sex ratio in China, many more men than women. That might be a factor of people trying to get out of specific areas in China. I'm talking even about internal migration as well. And environmental disasters like climate change, like so floods, and then also like epidemics or earthquakes, hurricanes, all these different factors that might happen in a specific area of origin might make people get out of those areas and look for a life somewhere else. And what are some examples of factors that influence, that attract people to specific areas of destination? Job opportunities, good schools, good education opportunities, cheaper schools or high quality schools. It's exactly the case here of College Station. It attracts a lot of people moving here because there's like a big university, also a big community college here in town that attracts a lot of people coming from other parts of the state. Higher income, which is related to higher employment opportunities in specific areas. Better climate and living condition. Southern areas that are usually warmer areas attract a lot of people in older ages after they retire. That's the case of Florida. That's the case of Texas. But Florida now, exactly because of all this climate change, starts to work in the other way, to not attract people as much. And different types of activities. If it's a society that has more complex, it's a more organized and complex society in which I have all sorts of jobs, that might influence people to move to those areas because they can get jobs in all these different occupations. So when we look at these factors, both in areas of origin and destination, we see what are the main factors stimulating or making people migrate from a specific group of areas to another group of areas. If we see that specific migration flow is mostly a response to push factors, to negative factors in the areas of origin, then migrants tend to be negatively selected. What it means in this case here. Because these people are facing all these problems here in area of origin, they will want to move to other areas, not because other areas have this good opportunities, but mostly because they are facing all these issues in the area of origin. They will tend to be more poorly educated and have lower skills in terms of jobs that they could perform. But in this case here, exactly because they are negatively selected, the area of origin is changed positively, because you usually have people with lower levels of education getting out, and then the areas that the people that stay back home are exactly the ones that can deal with all these issues here because they have better socioeconomic conditions, better education, and so on. And this term selection, self-selection, is really important in migration. People do not migrate from one area to the other with the same chances as other people. Usually people with certain characteristics are more likely to migrate to other areas. Even in this example here, that maybe these people are experiencing all these negative characteristics in their origin and trying to get out of there, even they being negatively selected, the ones within this group that actually ended getting out of those areas, they are usually on average better educated, have better skills among this specific group, right? We're gonna see throughout the course the discussion about how some immigrants from Latin America that usually have low socioeconomic indicators and education indicators and lower skill, we would expect them to have worse health outcomes or higher mortality, but they have actually better health outcomes than other groups in the same levels of socioeconomic characteristics. That's called the Hispanic paradox, the health Hispanic paradox. That is, people that usually have lower levels of education, lower levels of skill compared to people in the destination, not compared to people in the origin. Comparing the people in the destination, they still have better health outcomes, exactly because there is a selectivity even within this group. So whenever we say that immigrants are coming from one country to the other, actually the best ones on average are coming from one country to the other. Among those groups of people, they are affected by these negative factors here. And they usually have better outcomes, in my example here, health outcomes, than other people in the destination with the same levels of education and job skills. If a specific migration flow happens more as a response to positive factors or area of destination, kind of attracting people, these migrants will tend to be more positively selected. They're often more educated and innovative than even people in the destination. The area of origin loses a valuable segment of the population. That's related to the drain brain of like several countries, developing countries, that they have specific subgroup of the population with good levels of education and job skills. They might see other more developed countries with better job opportunities, so they migrate there, they have more education, they are more innovative, and then the country of origin will lose those people that could work to help the economic development in those areas. And now I'm going to go, this part here I'm dividing into internal migration theories and international migration theories. I will start now on the slides about internal migration theory, just focusing here on these 5 theories. And as I said before, each one of them focus on specific aspects. The most interesting studies that try to understand specific migration flows, they try to understand how all these different factors influence migration. So the neoclassical migration theory is more related to individual decision, more economic approach. New economics of labor migration is more at the individuals done at the household level. Spatio-temporal migration theories and structuralism more related to major changes that societies are passing through. And sociological human ecology, more related to an aggregate analysis of the reasons of why people are migrating from one area to the other. What's important to emphasize here once again is that they complement each other. They are not fighting with each other. An important, like maybe the most well-known demographer that does studies about migration in the US and mostly on international migration, Douglas Massey, a professor at the Princeton University, he has several papers in which he tries to focus on what are the factors driving migration from Mexico to the US. And in his studies, he uses a bunch of different data that his team collected, data from other sources. And this data, they try to create indicators that would say, that would try to measure the reasons related to the neoclassical migration theory. Are these indicators really explaining the migration from Mexico to the US? What about these other indicators related to the new economics of labor migration? What about these other indicators here? So they try to create an analysis in which they test all theories at the same time, try to explain which ones have better explanation to that specific migration. In this case, I'm not, the example that I gave here was not internal migration, but international migration. So I will just go through each one of them. So first one, the new classical migration theory sees migration primarily as a function of geographical differences in the relatively scarcity of labor. And Todaro was this economist that kind of like focused a lot on trying to explain why internal migration, what are the factors that drive internal migration. And he was trying to see exactly the migration from rural to urban areas. He mentioned migration from rural to urban areas might continue to happen even if income in urban areas on average might be actually small than income in rural areas. But if people have expectations, the knowledge that they have about the area of destination, they have the expectation that they will have better earnings than in the areas that they live right now, they will tend to migrate from these rural to urban areas. So what he's emphasizing here is that, yeah, migration is a result of individual decisions, and individuals, they don't know everything about both opportunities in the area of origin and destination. They have limited information. And even if the area of destination might not give them the job opportunities that they expect, that would be better than where they are now, they might still continue to move if they expect that, if that's related to their perception, if that's related to the limited information that they have about the area of destination. Even if they have friends that already live there, because their friends provide them information that's not actually true about the whole area of destination. So he's pretty much emphasized that this migration from rural to urban areas will continue if the expectation that I have about my life in the area of destination better than if I just stay where I am. This framework is also known as the functionalist theory. And overall, people move from rural to urban areas. So people moving from rural areas, they will cause labor to be less scarce at the destination. So we have more workers going to urban areas, so we have more supply of workers, and we're going to have scarcer supply of workers in the areas that lost those migrants. And this is really related to that region spatial economic equilibrium theory by Ravenstein from the 1800s. In which this process will result in growing convergence between wages at the sending and receiving areas. Remember the idea. The idea is that people will keep moving from a specific area to the other until the opportunities in both areas tend to go to an equilibrium. So this new classical migration theory really emphasizes individual decisions of rational individuals, and that migration will keep happening until we reach this equilibrium, and if my expectations keep being positive in relation to the area of destination, right? The new economics of labor migration, it now includes decision at the household level. The new economics of labor migration argues that most migration in developing countries can only be understood as a household rather than an individual decision. Migration decision generates income diversification rather than maximization. It's not necessarily the fact that I individually will make more money. The thing is, like, actually maybe only one person in the household might migrate to another area within that same country, because if I migrate by myself, maybe I can send money back from my house to my household. We are talking here more now about internal migration. A really clear example of this is internal migration in China. In China, in order for you to move from rural to urban areas, or move from one area to the other, within China, you have to have the government approval. If you don't have this government approval, and you still migrate from rural to urban areas, you will not be able to access education, the education system of destination, will not be able to access public health services, and will not be able to get a job in the formal labor market. So when people move into urban areas in China without the government approval, they tend to move by themselves, not all the family members. Children stay back home because they're back home, they can access these government services, education, health, and so on. So they move by themselves, they start to work on the informal labor market, but they are making more money, even being the informal labor market in urban areas, than if they were back at home, and they can send money back home, right? This term remittances is more related to people sending money back home into other countries, but sending money back home, it can be also within a country. In this case, I'm giving the example of China, that's something that this internal migration happens. It's happening right now in these recent years in China. So it is a conscious attempt to overcome fading markets and socioeconomic inequalities. In this example, people moving from rural to urban areas in China. Even being a theory that emphasizes decisions at the household level, the new economics of labor migration is still a theory that it's considered to be an analysis that emphasizes the micro-level reasons of people migrating. And it's a micro-level theory applied to particular forms of migration. It is not able to explain long-term global migration patterns and trends and how these are connected to broader development processes, because it's still a micro-level theory that's trying to understand not only individual decisions as the new classical, but household decisions. It's not look at structural inequalities that exist between areas and between countries. The spatio-temporal migration theories, they define migration as a constituent part of broader development processes. So here we start to look not only at the individual and household decisions, but also at larger context, how the specific society is organized and how other societies are organized and how one attracts more people than other areas. The development process coincides with increased levels of migration and overall mobility. So usually higher levels of development generates higher level of migration. I don't think I put here a graph. Let me see if I can do something really high tech here right now. I just think it doesn't work well. I just see this is the vertical axis here, and that's the horizontal axis. This horizontal axis here is development. And this vertical axis here is migration. If a country has higher development, it will attract more people. And so migration will tend to increase as development increases. So this is immigration, right? Or in-migration, if you're talking about internal migration. On the other hand, countries that have really low levels of development, the population might be so poor that they don't have the means to go to other areas. So their immigration or out-migration is low. But as those areas start to increase a little bit more in development, people start to have the means to migrate to other areas. But as these areas start to develop even more, they say, hey, I have enough conditions here, so I will not immigrate anymore. So immigration goes more like this, like a parabola. It's quadratic. All right, so here is immigration. It's really fancy graphs here. I can include afterwards another slide to this lecture. So as level of development increases, areas attract more immigrants. As specific areas develop, people will start to have the means to get out of those areas. They will tend to get out as out migrants if it's internally, or immigrants if it's internationally. But afterwards, I can just stay in the area where I live because I have job opportunities. So immigration rates will tend to decline. So that's what is being emphasized here. Okay. And cool. So, like I said, I will just add another slide here exactly with this association between development and migration. But as I said, development has that exponential effect on immigration, on attraction, always increasing, and it has more a quadratic. It increases and then decreases in the case of immigration, right? So processes are associated with modernization, economic development, urbanization, and demographic transition. So that word that I mentioned in the horizontal axis as development is related to a lot of different things. The overall modernization of a country, of an area, and can be also related to cultural factors, economic factors, more services being available in the urban areas, not just related to economic conditions, but also to health and to education. And demographic transition. So as people tend to have fewer children dying, having lower mortality rates, that's also related to more development in specific areas. And the structuralist theory is pretty much like based on the Karl Marx theory, so it's known as the new Marxist theory, also center periphery theory, criticizes the first one that we saw on this topic of internal migration theory, criticizes the new classical theory. The new classical theory is the one that emphasizes the push and pull factors. The structuralist sees a general pattern of disruptions, dislocations, and migrations intrinsic to capitalism. So capitalism generates the generation of wealth, development, but also poverty and inequality. So people move from one area within a country to the other, also related to all these structural changes in society. The functionalist approach that we saw before, assuming socioeconomic forces, tends toward equilibrium through migration. As we reach that equilibrium between areas, in this case, example, within a country, migration would tend to stop. The structuralist approach says, no, if you have a society, such as the capitalist society, that continues to generate poverty and inequality, migration flows will keep happening because it's related to those changes in society. Even though they have different ways to understand why migration happens, they do have similar assumptions that development leads to less immigration, exactly that graph that I just showed you by drawing here on the slide. And higher development differences across areas, more differences between areas, between the space, leads to more migration. I might have put that graph in the lecture specific about the chapter of migration. Here is more like a summary about it, but I will check it out. The sociological human ecology. Remember the human ecological theory, the ecological human theory that we talked back about fertility, back here. The human ecological theory. Here we are kind of like showing that we will not focus more on individuals, we will focus on societies. The same thing, the same framework can be implemented to migration. So the sociological human ecology, the ecological theory applied to migration, focus on population characteristics to predict migration. It's not about individual decisions. I'm trying to understand why some areas tend to attract more migration, why some areas tend to actually have more out migrants, decrease the size through migration, why some areas are not influenced by migration at all. The questions here are not about individuals. It's about the characteristics of the areas as a whole. Migration is the major mechanism of social change and adaptability for human populations. Populations will redistribute themselves via net migration to attain equilibrium. It's kind of a little bit related to the new classical approach of the equilibrium, but it's not focusing much on individual decisions, but it's trying to understand more the characteristics of the areas as areas that we tend to have more in migration and areas that we tend to have more out migration. And the main concepts on this theory are related to population, organization, the environment, and technological advances. So we are not really so much interested on individual characteristics, but the overall society. This term, ecology, in this case here, both here, human ecology in this theory, trying to understand migration flows, and in the previous one that we saw about fertility, this term ecology here it's not related to the environment, to nature. Ecology here is related to the group, right? I'm trying to understand what are the characteristics of that group that explains migration. What are the characteristics of that group in the previous slides that explain a specific society having less or more children? I don't know if you might have heard the term called ecological fallacy. Ecological fallacy is when you get information about the group of a specific community, but you make a mistake. Instead of saying that that's the characteristic of the population as a whole, you might say that, oh, this is happening because those specific people are causing this and that. Example. Let's say that we have neighborhood A and neighborhood B. And neighborhood A has 70% of African Americans, and neighborhood B has 70% of non-Hispanic white. So A, 70% African Americans, B, 70% white. Let's say that I get the information for the group, for that group A, neighborhood A, and group B, neighborhood B. And let's say that I see higher crime rates in neighborhood A and lower crime rates in neighborhood B. If I said, oh, there are higher crime rates in neighborhood A because there are more African Americans, that would be a mistake I'm doing, because I did not ask each individual in each one of these neighborhoods if they committed a crime or not. I just have this aggregated information about race composition and about crime rates. Maybe crime being reported, being high in neighborhood A, might be committed mostly by the 30% of the population that's white in this example. Right? So I don't know who is committing the crime in neighborhood A. And I don't know who is committing the crime in neighborhood B, because my information is for the area as a whole. So when I get information for the area as a whole, I have to be careful. I have to be careful how I interpret that data. Because if I get aggregated level data, and then I talk about individuals, I'm making a mistake. I'm doing a wrong analysis. I'm committing ecological fallacy. So ecological fallacy, it's when I have aggregated level about the area as a whole, but then I start to interpret that data as the data was at the individual level, but it's not, okay? In this example of neighborhood A and B and crime rates is usually a typical example that we try to explain ecological fallacy. I did not talk about migration. So the neoclassical emphasizes individual, the new economics of labor migration, household. And then the structuralist and the spatio-temporal migration, more major composition of the society, changes through time, historical changes. And the sociological human ecology also try to understand the equilibrium, but not looking at individuals as much, but areas. All these theories, they bring us some important factors, try to see which ones are important to explain specific migration flows. Some of them might be better to explain specific migration flows between specific areas within a specific time period. Others might be for other cases. Right? It's good to think that they complement each other. You have to test all of them in your analysis. And now, international migration theories. And here I'm getting this from exactly Douglas Massey, the professor that I just mentioned before from Princeton. And this is a 1994 paper in which he pretty much summarizes all these different migration theories related to international population flows. And he divides them in two, initiation of international migration and continuation of migration. The initiation of international migration theories, they try to understand why people start to move from one country to the other. The continuation is after that specific flow of people from one country to the other started to happen, what are the factors that make that flow continue to happen in the following years, in the following decades? So here we're going to talk about the new classical economics and the new household economics of migration, which are related to the previous ones that we talk about in migration. The segmented labor market theory and the world systems theory. In the continuation of migration, I will focus more on network theory, but I will also mention the institutional theory and the cumulative causation. So the four related to initiation of international migration. The new classical economics, it's related to the supply and demand of workers and job opportunities. And we try to see if specific areas will tend to equilibrium and then the migration would stop. The new household economics of migration is like people try to maximize the income of specific households. So one member of the household might move out and then send money back to the people that stay back in the home country through remittances. The segmented labor market theory pretty much emphasizes that the societies are divided in two sectors, the primary sector and the secondary sector. The primary sector usually have more well-educated people, better salaries, and better benefits. And the secondary sector has lower wages, is more unstable, people can get fired more often, and is usually rejected by people born in that specific country. So usually, immigrants from other countries usually tend to concentrate in jobs within the secondary sector. And migration will keep happening if these sectors keep demanding jobs. So if that specific society, those specific sectors have job opportunities for people, they have a demand for more workers, people will keep moving into those countries. So this theory emphasizes this demand-driven process. The word system theory. Peripheral countries are most likely to send migrants to core nations. So here it's talking about all these inequalities, all these disruptions that we see in the development of capitalism globally in all across the world, right? So just going a little bit more in detail in each one of the four. The new classical economic theory of international migration is the oldest and best known. You see, it's related to even to the works of Ravenstein, of Todaro, and so on. It focuses on labor migration of people trying to get better job opportunities. Migration happens due to individual cost-benefit decisions to maximize expected incomes. Do you remember Todaro? Todaro said people will tend to move from rural to urban areas, even if urban areas on average are not paying more. But if they expect it to pay more, they will keep moving. Same thing applies to international migration. People move from low-wage countries to high-wage countries. So people are doing a cost-benefit. Oh, I'm going to lose all my connections with the country of origin, lose connections with family members, friends, and so on. But there is the benefit of getting better jobs and better education to my children, and so on. The new household economics. The new household economics theory of migration challenged the neoclassical theory. Migration decisions are not only related to individual decisions, but also to decisions done at a larger level, families and households. Okay, migration happens, to increase individual earnings, but not only that, to increase also the sources of income to household, so these households will have lower risks of entering poverty, so we'll protect the family from possible unemployment and issues that those families are experiencing. And there are several studies, several papers, dissertations being done focusing on the effects of remittances on the area of origin. So people migrate from one country to the other, and these migrants send money back to the country of origin, and how this money actually affects their origin, because those families, they will have better earnings on average than those people that do not have any immigrant from their household. And the community as a whole will benefit, because those families having this extra money might start to invest on private businesses and services that community would not have experienced before. So remittances are good not only for the household of origin that will receive this money directly, but also to the community as a whole. The segmented labor market theory. Migration flows are a result of the demands of the economic structure of individual societies, industrial societies. So it is caused by and pull factors. And as I mentioned before, this theory emphasizes that the labor market has two major sectors, the primary sector and the secondary sector. And these sectors are a consequence of the development of capitalism. And exactly because this theory emphasizes these two sectors, this theory is also known as the dual labor market theory. The primary sector usually has more stable jobs, jobs with higher earnings, better benefits for retirement, health insurance, and so on, good working conditions. And the secondary sector has more unstable jobs, low-paying jobs, limited benefits to the workers, and more unpleasant hazardous working conditions. And usually, employers use migrants to fill jobs in the secondary sector exactly because the native population is usually better educated. They tend to go work more likely in the primary sector. I'm not saying that native population is not here. We also have people working in bad jobs, even those that were born in a specific country. But proportionally, there are more immigrants here, right? And it's demand driven with the idea that this society needs workers for this job in the primary sector and need these workers to take this job characteristics in the secondary sector. So the society is demanding those workers. Because there is this demand, immigrants will keep coming, right? It's not a matter of building, increasing the security in the border. It's a matter of how the society is organized and need those workers to develop. The world systems theory, the migration is the result of globalization of the market theory, of the market economy. In the process of global industrialization, population is released from traditional industries, from agriculture, from farming, state-owned industries and handicrafts, and this creates mobilized population to move both internally and internationally. So it's just how the society now being more integrated, and we start to have more automation in agriculture. So we don't need so many workers in traditional industries. Even for car manufacturing, all these activities start to be more automated. People start to look for other jobs in the service industry, in the service jobs and so on. And that's being observed right now in the US. For example, a lot of like we see in Midwestern states in the US, a lot of these factories that are firing people in these last decades exactly because everything starts to be more automated, they need less workers. These people that tend to have before stable jobs start to maybe not moving from other areas, but at least they have to get other jobs. And these other jobs are usually more concentrated in the service sector and are more low-paying jobs. The global market economy attracts employees with higher human capital to specific global cities, and high human capital here can be measured by different indicators. Knowledge, which is related to education, experience in the labor market, skills to the job market is related to training, education attainment, and productivity. A way to usually, whenever we don't have so refined information to measure human capital of people, we usually use how many years those people work in the labor market and education attainment. If you don't have information about experience in the labor market, how many years those people worked throughout their lives in the labor market, you can simply use age. So age as a proxy for employment and for experience in the labor market, with the idea that usually older people tend to have more years of experience in education as a measure of knowledge, skills, and productivity. And in this global market economy, some global cities start to attract more immigrants, and clear examples of those, New York, LA, and Chicago, are here in the US because of the US being in such high level of development, of economic development. And then the final theories related to, okay, after the migration starts, why does it continue to happen? So that's what the network theory, the institutional theory, and the cumulative causation theory try to explain. Migrants establish interpersonal ties with the people that were left behind. Once started, migration sustains itself through diffusion, because if I have a friend who migrated before to another country, I have more knowledge of the opportunities in this other country. Institutional theory, institutions facilitate or profit from the continued flow of migrants. Organizations help perpetuate migration in the face of government attempts to limit the flow of migrants. A really clear case of a historical fact that made forced migration here in the US is exactly from Africa to the US. So all these migrants forced moved to come to the US to work in labor is exactly because you had a society all organized through slavery in order to keep the society rolling. So that's how the society institutionally was organized to get more people coming in. In this case, of course, forced migration to work as slaves. Cumulative causation. Migration has an impact on social environments of sending and receiving regions. And this cumulative causation is related to what we have been talking here the whole time. That is not just one group of theories that explain a migration flow. A series of factors help us understand the migration flows. And this paper here, the 1997 paper of Massa and Espinosa, kind of take exactly the theories that he explained in 1994, and then they test with a series of databases to see what are the theories that better explain the migration from Mexico to the US. And just explaining just the new migration network theory a little more. So the migration network theory focuses on interpersonal ties. These ties connect migrants, formal migrants, potential migrants, and non-migrants in the area of origin and destination. So if I live in a community, even if I don't have friends or family members who move to another country, but that community has a high proportion of people who migrated, so I will have better knowledge of how to move to this other country. I'm creating some social networks, some social ties that make me more likely to that area because other people behind me from a community did. Networks increase the likelihood of migration. They decrease migration risks and costs, increase net earnings to migration, and they make it easier for migrants to find jobs and access resources in the destination. Exactly because now I have all these connections with other people that I know, or my community has all the specific agencies that might help me migrate, that will decrease the risk. What are the risks of migrating, not finding a job, for example? So I'll be more likely to find a job if I have this social network. So here are the different papers that I use. For example, Ravenstein, The Laws of Migration from 1885 and 89. Todaro, he has this article, and also these two articles that I put here, but he has also books on this topic. And let me just see here, because I mentioned that we might, I want to just show you that graph. Let me just see if I put it in the other lecture here. If I did not, I will just add into this specific lecture today, and I can send it to you by email when I make that change. So this is the chapter about international migration. And if it's not there, what I was going to try to do, let me just show you from another slide that I'm sure that's there. theories of migration. The graph that I did, I draw it so beautifully in PowerPoint. This one is a class for grad students, so it goes more in detail about each one of them. This one here. This one is the graph that I tried to draw earlier. So as development increases, specific countries try to attract more people, so immigration increases. And areas that have really low level of development, people don't even have the means to get out, but as they start to develop, people start to have higher chances to move out. And then after a while, they will say, oh, we can just stay in this country that I will have job opportunities, so the chances of emigrating decrease. So this one here, this slide was, if you just go to home, demography, migration, and this was the class on theories of migration. So these slides are there, but I will add this slide here into our lecture and you can download it again. So the quiz 7 is open now. Do take the quiz. On 30% of the people did not take the previous quiz. Every point counts. Only 12% of the class at this point have an A. So take advantage of the quizzes. Thank you very much and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.